A man's final day with his best friend. The knock came just as Michael was pouring his morning coffee. He paused, expecting a delivery or a neighbor, but instead, he found Max, his golden retriever, struggling to get up from the living room floor. It wasn't the first time he'd seen his old companion move slower than usual, but this time something felt different. "Max, buddy, what's going on?" Michael knelt beside him, gently scratching behind his ears. Max's tail wagged weakly, but his usual spark seemed dimmer. Michael's chest tightened as he helped him to his feet. "You're just tired, right? Too much fetch yesterday?" His words were light, but his heart wasn't. By the time they made it outside, the autumn air carried a chill, and Michael noticed Max favoring one leg. The once energetic dog that used to race through the fields now walked cautiously, every step a reminder of the years they'd shared. Later that day, Michael called the vet. He expected reassurance, a quick visit, maybe some vitamins, but instead, the vet's voice was heavy. "He's getting older, Michael. There's arthritis, but we should run some tests to check for anything more serious." Michael sat in silence after hanging up. How had the years passed so quickly? He glanced at the framed photo on the mantel, Max as a puppy, bounding through the grass, his ears too big for his head. Michael smiled, but his throat tightened. As evening fell, Max lay by Michael's feet, his breathing steady but slower than usual. Michael reached down, resting a hand on his head. "We've still got time, buddy," he whispered. "We've got time." But deep down, he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince, Max or himself. Michael woke up the next morning to Max nudging his hand with his nose. The old dog's wagging tail made Michael smile, even if it was slower than it used to be. But the memory of Max struggling to stand the night before lingered in his mind. Something wasn't right, and Michael couldn't ignore it any longer. "Okay, bud," Michael said, scratching Max behind the ears. "We're going to see Dr. Patel today, just to make sure everything's okay." Max tilted his head, as if he understood. Michael called the vet's office and managed to get a last-minute appointment. As the morning passed, he tried to distract himself, cleaning, flipping through old photo albums, but his eyes kept drifting to Max, who was curled up in his usual spot by the window. He looked peaceful, but Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By the time they arrived at the vet's office, Michael's stomach was in knots. Max seemed calm, his tail wagging faintly as they walked inside. The waiting room was quiet, save for the occasional bark or meow from other pets. Michael rubbed Max's head, his fingers brushing over the gray fur that hadn't been there a year ago. When they were called back, Dr. Patel greeted them warmly. She'd been Max's vet since he was a puppy and had always been patient and kind. But as she began her examination, her brow furrowed, and Michael's unease deepened. "Michael," she said gently after finishing her checkup, "Max is showing signs of more than just arthritis. I'd like to run some tests to be sure." Michael nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Whatever you need to do." The next 2 days were a blur of waiting. Michael tried to stay positive, telling himself it was probably nothing serious. But when the vet's office called, the tone of the assistant's voice made his heart sink. "Dr. Patel would like you to come in to discuss Max's results." Sitting in the exam room again, Michael listened as Dr. Patel explained the findings. "Max has a tumor," she said, her voice soft. "It's spread to his abdomen. At his age, surgery isn't a viable option, and we can only focus on keeping him comfortable." Michael's world seemed to tilt. He stared at Max, who sat beside him, unaware of the weight of the words being spoken. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Dr. Patel hesitated. "Weeks, maybe a couple of months, it's hard to say." The ride home was silent. Max leaned his head against Michael's arm, his presence grounding him. Michael's mind raced with memories. Puppy kisses, hikes in the woods, nights spent on the couch together. How could he say goodbye to the best friend who had been there for everything? Back home, Michael sat on the floor beside Max, stroking his fur. "We're going to make the most of this, buddy," he said. He didn't know how, but he knew one thing for sure. Max deserved the best final chapter Michael could give him. The next morning, Michael woke up with a sense of determination. Max deserved more than quiet afternoons and somber days. If these were their last weeks together, they would be full of memories. just like the good old times. Michael opened the closet where he kept Max's leash. The jingle of the metal clip made Max's ears perk up. His tail thumped against the floor, slow but steady. "You up for an adventure, buddy?" Michael asked, his voice light despite the lump in his throat. Max gave a low, excited bark in response. Michael packed a bag with water, Max's favorite treats, and an old blanket. The two of them drove out to the trailhead where they used to hike every weekend. It wasn't a long drive, but as the trees began to line the road and the air smelled of pine, Michael felt a pang of nostalgia. This had been their place, a haven away from the world. The trail was quieter than usual, and Michael was grateful. He didn't want to share these moments with anyone else. As they started walking, Max sniffed everything in sight, his tail wagging at the familiar scents. Michael smiled, even as he noticed the slight limp in Max's gait and the way he paused more often to catch his breath. They reached their favorite spot, a clearing with a small stream running through it. Michael spread the blanket out and sat down, patting the space next to him. Max plopped down heavily, his head resting on Michael's knee. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the stream filling the air. "You remember this spot, don't you?" Michael asked, scratching Max behind the ears. "We came here after I got that promotion. I brought you a steak and you ate it in 2 bites. Max's ears twitched, and Michael laughed softly. "I should have brought a steak today," he said, "but I didn't think about it. Sorry, buddy." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Michael pulled out his phone. He took a picture of Max lying beside him, his gray fur glowing in the soft light. "One for the memories," Michael whispered, though he knew he'd never forget this moment. On the way back, Max's energy waned and Michael had to help him into the car. As they drove home, Michael glanced at Max in the rearview mirror. The dog's head rested on the edge of the seat, his eyes half closed, but he looked content. That night, Michael cooked a small steak for Max. "I promised you one, didn't I?" he said, placing the plate on the floor. Max ate slowly, savoring each bite, and Michael couldn't help but smile through the tears that stung his eyes. As Max curled up in his bed later that evening, Michael knelt beside him. "I don't know how to do this without you," he said softly. Max licked his hand, his eyes filled with the quiet understanding only a dog could offer. Michael fell asleep on the floor next to Max's bed, the sound of his steady breathing a comfort in the quiet night. Michael woke up in the middle of the night to find Max whimpering softly in his sleep. The sound wasn't loud, but it pierced through the silence like a knife. Michael sat up quickly, his heart racing. Max's body shuddered slightly, and his breathing was labored. "Max," Michael whispered, reaching out to gently stroke his fur. The dog stirred, opening his eyes briefly before resting his head back down. Michael grabbed a blanket and draped it over Max, hoping it would ease his discomfort. He sat beside him, his back against the wall, and listened to the rhythmic yet strained sound of Max's breathing. The vet had said this might happen, moments when Max's body would struggle, even while he rested. Michael had tried to prepare himself for it, but nothing could prepare him for the helplessness he felt now. He picked up his phone and scrolled through old photos, his thumb hovering over each memory. There was Max, a tiny ball of fur on the day Michael brought him home. Max chasing a ball in the park, his ears flopping with every bounce. Max sitting by the Christmas tree, a red bow tied around his neck. Michael smiled at the memories, but the ache in his chest grew. He glanced at Max, who had fallen back into a restless sleep. "You've been with me through it all, buddy," Michael said softly. "I wish I could take this pain away from you." The night felt endless, and Michael found himself praying for morning. He wanted more time, one more day, one more hour, one more moment. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the blinds, Max stirred again. He lifted his head slightly, his eyes meeting Michael's. The connection was fleeting but powerful, as if Max was saying, "I'm still here, but not for much longer." Michael swallowed hard, determined to make the day as peaceful as possible. Max deserved that much, and Michael wouldn't let him down. The morning was quiet, the air still. Michael sat beside Max on the porch, a warm blanket wrapped around them both. The autumn leaves fell gently, the world seemingly aware of the weight of the moment. Max leaned his head against Michael's leg, his breaths shallow but steady. Michael ran his fingers through Max's fur, memorizing every soft strand. "Remember when we moved here, buddy? You were so excited to chase squirrels in the yard." He chuckled softly, though his voice wavered. "I thought you'd never let me unpack." Max's tail gave a faint wag, and Michael felt a bittersweet warmth in his chest. He knew Max couldn't understand his words, but he could feel the love behind them. The vet was coming that afternoon. Michael had made the call, his voice breaking as he arranged for the visit. He knew it was the kindest thing he could do for Max, but it didn't make it any easier. As the hours passed, Michael took Max to his favorite spots one last time. They sat by the old oak tree in the park where Max had dug countless holes. They walked, slowly, carefully, down the path by the river where Max had once splashed like a pup. Every step felt heavier, every moment more precious. When they returned home, Max seemed tired but content. Michael sat with him on the living room floor, holding him close. "You've been my best friend, Max. My constant. I don't know how I'll do this without you." Tears streamed down Michael's face as he whispered, "It's okay to let go, buddy. You've done more for me than I could ever repay." When the vet arrived, Michael held Max close, his hands trembling. Max's body was frail, his eyes tired, but his gaze was full of love and trust. Michael pressed his forehead to Max's and closed his eyes, feeling the rise and fall of his loyal companion's chest one last time. And then, Max was gone. The house was unbearably quiet that night. Michael sat on the porch, staring at the stars. Max's collar rested in his hands, the tag jingling softly as he turned it over. He whispered, "Good night, Max. Sleep well." The wind carried the faint rustle of leaves as if the world itself was grieving. And though Michael felt the weight of his loss, he knew one thing for certain. Max had given him a love that would never fade, a bond that even time couldn't break.